So you've just done your Mastery Connect quiz. I'll look at the scores there. The ones that I saw as I went through, it looks like the biggest issue is reading comprehension still. So we're going to keep working on that. What we're going to focus on today is continuing working on the skills that you need to do that narrative writing next week. Okay? So we're going to focus on conflict and point of view because that's what you need to write the narrative. All right, since you guys didn't do your homework, we're going to do a couple of these together just to help you learn, but we're not going over all of them since you don't have the answers. But we are going to do a couple just to kind of help. All right, so example of irony. We practiced this objectivity in our current events class. Remember, irony is a contradiction. So you're looking for where in one sentence, two words are the opposite, or you're looking where one sentence is maybe the opposite of another sentence, or you're looking for where she doesn't really mean that, like she's being sarcastic. That's what you're looking for in this paragraph to identify the irony. So we practiced this objectivity, and we remember from our discussion yesterday that objectivity means that you're not biased. In our current events class, it was never explicitly tied to identity. Who can tell me what explicitly means? All right, so explicitly means to just come out and say, it was never explicitly tied to identity, but it was implied. Okay, what I just talked about, the IM means internal, so implied means it's not actually said, but everyone understands, that's what they mean. I learned that the best person to talk about wealth in class was an upper middle class person because she could supposedly look at it dispassionately. Okay, we talked about dis when we did our prefixes at the beginning of the year. And what does dis mean? Who can remember? Good. Dispassionately means not passionately. Okay, question? The best person to talk about race was a white person for the same reasons. The best person to talk about gender was a boy. So looking at this, does she really mean the best person to talk about gender was a boy? No, she's being sarcastic, isn't she?
Yes.
Okay. Does she really mean the best person to talk about race is a white person?
Yes.
That's what she is saying. But she's being sarcastic here because if you look it up here where it says not bias, do you really think that based on the story that it is the white people that focus on the race? No, it's the opposite, isn't it? And that is the definition of irony, is opposite or contradiction. So in this case, this is going to be your irony. Okay? And it's verbal because she doesn't actually mean that. She's being sarcastic. Okay? How is this ironic? So you're going to explain to me, how is this ironic? So you look at our examples and you would do what I just said. You would say, she is being sarcastic. You need to talk to all races and gender. Okay. And you can keep going with that, and you could tie it into the explicitly part, but as a short answer, that works. Okay. If we were having a class discussion, if everyone had done their homework, then we would talk about how it was also tied to the implied meaning of it. Okay. All right, the next one. Find an example of sensory language. I'm going to switch my colors here for you. So sensory language, we've talked about this. This is something you can see, feel, touch, hear, or if there's dialogue, say. Well, we know there's not dialogue, so that one's easy to rule out. So when we look at this, is there a description that really stands out at you? By tying the upper middle class here to the specific race, you can see who she's talking about. So your imagery, your sensory language would be in red. Okay. I don't want to just draw lines everywhere. So how does this influence the passage? Based on that imagery, and we just talked about this, you can see who she believes is upper middle class. What is the main idea of the paragraph? So in one sentence, what is this paragraph about? So the main idea is that in the author's opinion, okay, those of the upper middle class and race are biased in this school. Okay, that's what the paragraph is about. And to get that, you had to really get the irony. And that's why I focused on irony yesterday, saying it was so important, because otherwise your main idea is wrong, isn't it? And they do that all the time. Okay. All right, characterize the speaker. So based on what we read, she's using the sarcastic tone and the bias that she's talking about. So those aren't really her. I mean, she is sarcastic, and that people who are sarcastic, it is a characteristic of them. But in this case, it's kind of borderline, because she's using her sarcasm. And when she uses that sarcasm, we can see that she's kind of jealous and bitter about her situation. And this is where we see it, is through the sarcasm. So in this case, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a personality trait, even though it's a gray area, kind of is. I would say the closer characteristic is that she's bitter and jealous, jealous of the other students and kind of bitter at her situation. All right. And the mother, do we know anything about the mother at this point? No. Okay, so this one would be nothing yet. Okay. Okay, so the next part is we're going to analyze conflict and point of view. Again, understanding conflict and point of view are important, because your writing task is to take My Mother's Garden and rewrite it from the point of view of the mother. And if you don't understand conflict and point of view, that is an impossible task. So it is really important that you understand these two skills. We talked about this already, multiple times actually, about a plot line. So let's look at, as a review, when you have plots typically follow the formula. I talked about how Poe set it up. And the first thing that's going to happen is you are going to introduce your characters and your situation. When you are rewriting the narrative, or when you're writing any narrative, you start talking about the characters, their background, the setting, how are they where they are. So if you think about the situation with My Mother's Garden, from the daughter's point of view, it started at school, didn't it? But from the mother's perspective, did the problem really start at school? No. So your introduction is not going to be the same as the daughter's, and that's why understanding point of view helps. So what you have to do is you have to look at it and you have to go, okay, from the mom's point of view, where does this story start? And that is going to be your introduction. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, it doesn't really tell us in the story where mom starts. That's why it's a narrative. It's fiction. You are writing it. In your opinion, based on the evidence from the text, where is the mother's situation going to start? And that's where you'll look at the conflict that we'll talk about in just a minute. All right, then there's a problem or conflict. This is going to be introduced probably at the end of the first paragraph, maybe partially into the second paragraph. If you look at our graphic, typically the conflict is introduced right here, okay? And this is typically one paragraph. And so this would be at the very end of the first paragraph. That doesn't mean that you have to follow this formula exactly. So if you introduce the conflict at the beginning of the second paragraph or partway through the second paragraph, you're going to be okay. But you cannot do it up here. Okay? You can't develop the story without mentioning the conflict first. And before you can write this, you're going to have to figure out, well, what is the conflict with the mom? It's not going to be the same as the conflict with the daughter. Right. Anybody confused as to how you're going to start the story? You start with her background, the setting, and then you talk about what her conflict is. Okay. Next, you're going to build the story. Okay. And if we think about the daughter's perspective, she talked about school, she talked about the garden, the kids there with the dialogue, and then she has a resolution. And you guys will do the same thing. You'll build, the story takes place, it doesn't say it's a full year, but it kind of implies it because it talks about how the next year the wealth concept was gone. From the mom's point of view, you can kind of decide whether or not you want it to be that full year like it was here, or if you want to narrow it down to like maybe the conflict with the guy of the housing. That's up to you. But the rising action is typically going to be 3 paragraphs. If you do it correctly, the conflict or the development of the conflict should be 3 paragraphs. And that's why you have 1, 2, 3 things there, is to show that. And then you're going to wrap it up. Okay? And we talked about with Poe, wrapping it up does not have to be this long, drawn out thing. In a narrative essay, typically it is 1 paragraph for the end. Okay, it's the conclusion. So you have a 5-paragraph essay. Paragraph, that's an R. And that's what makes up your 5 paragraphs. Okay. When you read the instructions, it just says multi-paragraph in the instructions, because for some writers, they're just stronger and they can develop it with 2 body paragraphs. I don't know that you could get a good score with less than 2 body paragraphs. Okay? Just because by definition, developing the plot means that you have to go into details, and that takes paragraphs to do. Okay? So if you're a really strong writer, and some of you are, and you've written 2 body paragraphs, it's better to stop there than to try to force a 3rd one that doesn't make sense. Okay? So as you go through this, even though it says 3 paragraphs, keep in mind that that's for the average writer. Okay? All right, and I've already gone over conflicts, so this is just a quick review, mainly for the kids at home who weren't here, or if you were absent that day when I went over conflict. Okay? There are different types of conflict: person versus person, person versus nature, society, and then self. And as you're writing this, do not start to write your narrative until you have figured out what you want your main conflict to be. Because if you do that, you're going to write this whole story without a conflict. It's just going to repeat yourself over and over and over again. Oh, the mom was this, the mom was this. But if you don't actually come out and make it clear what your interpretation of the conflict is, it's going to be a problem. So in your brainstorming phase that we're going to go over in a few minutes, you're going to want to decide. Now, we know it's not really going to be nature. I mean, I guess you could talk about her growing the garden, but that's not really a conflict in the story. So you're going to have to decide if it's going to be this one, or this one. And it can vary from person to person. The story has all of those in it. So what do you want to focus on? And what you focus on kind of tells how the story's going to go. Because if it's person versus self, the daughter says that she has never lied. She's not a liar. She's a hard worker. We talked about that. But she lied. And so that is a conflict that she had with herself. So if you're going to focus on that one, your story's going to revolve around that. But if it's person versus person, you have a lot more to work with because you have all those people that are trying to stop her. Society, You have the race aspect and the money aspect. So there's a lot to work with here. You just have to decide. Okay, so what we're going to do is you have your journals. For those at home, they are in Amplify. Okay, but in your journal, you picked them up when you came in the door. You were on page 70. So if everyone would turn to page 70 of their journal. All right, so what you're going to do is, if you look at page 70, this is talking about fish cheeks. And it's talking about fish cheeks because you're going to practice point of view and conflict. Just put it up there. With the easy story. Mm-hmm. So you're going to practice point of view and conflict with the easier story. So you're going to be with your partner. And you're going to, if you look at page 70, answer these questions. What is the primary conflict? Notice the word primary right here. Primary means there's more than one conflict, and you have to look at the one that kind of goes over the whole story. And that's one of the things that you guys are missing on quizzes when we talk about conflict, is you do choose a conflict. But the question asks for primary, so you have to look at the overarching conflict. So what is the biggest problem? And then how do you know that? You can do that one of two ways. You can highlight in your text the conflict, and then just write in your journal what page it is, and then I can easily reference it, or you can copy the line, whichever, it doesn't matter. But you're going to be sharing your answers, so you're going to need to have the evidence. And then you're going to do, at the end of the narrative, is the conflict resolved? Okay, so you and your partner will talk about, is it really resolved? And then, why do you think that? Some stories don't resolve the conflict. They leave you thinking. And then talk with your partner. Why did Tan do this? Like, why did she end the story this way? There's so many other things she could have done. And then this part is super important because it's the skill that you really need to work on, is during this time, you and your partner need to go through and go, you know what, during all these things, this is probably what the mom felt. Okay? All right, so go ahead and do that now. Okay, so the primary conflict in the narrative, what do you guys think it is?
The minister and Robert come over for Christmas dinner, and Amy is nervous on how what they think on their Christmas dinner.
So the kind of person versus person, the minister and their feelings versus how she's feeling?
Yeah.
Okay, that is definitely a conflict. Does anyone disagree that that's the main conflict?
No, I think so.
Okay. Does anyone have a different primary conflict?
I would say Amy.
I would tend to say, and you could argue mom, because she is kind of upset with her mother and the way that she did the dinner. But what her mom did was based on culture. And so it's almost the biggest conflict, the one that goes over the whole story, was Tan's, it could be herself and her culture, or you could do society, the Chinese culture. Either one, Tan herself or culture, I think is going to be the stronger one. I think Robert was a problem, but I think he was a symptom of the problem. Okay? He was something that she was trying to impress, and what was interfering with that was her culture. At the end of the narrative, is the conflict resolved?
Yes.
Okay. Because she looks back and she says, you know what, it was my favorite meal. And so it kind of does resolve itself if you look at her main conflict as the guilt and shame that she felt. Okay. Why do you think the author ended her story with, you know, hey, looking back, you know, my mom made my favorite meal, and so I was kind of ashamed at how I did. Why did she do that? Okay, so it's when it talks about her getting over her crush, it's almost like she's acknowledging she's grown up,
Yeah.
and that Robert was just a small part of her life. And that's why when I say that Robert was a conflict, he was, but he wouldn't be the main conflict, because if you look at the end of the story, it was, hey, I've grown up, Robert was nothing. Okay. Now, the mom during this time, how do you think the mom felt?
She,
You guys have the same textual evidence but different feelings, and so both of those are really good. You used for your evidence the fact that the mom made this huge meal for Amy, but you felt that the mom may have felt disrespected or disappointed because of Amy's reaction. And I think those are both very good answers. Okay, excellent. All right, and these are the answers. All right. Yeah. So that's kind of the same thing. We're going to skip ahead to practicing. Say that again. So this one's by yourself. You're going to practice what we just did together. So if you look on page 72 and 73 of your journal, and for those at home, it's on Amplify, it's a card. I want you to look at my mother's garden. The same questions that you just answered, but you're answering them about my mother's garden. So you're going to answer, what is the main conflict? Was the conflict resolved? Why do you think she ended her story that way? And you're going to tell me where you have the different points of view. How do you know it's in her point of view? And then find an example. And then how do you know if she's an adult? All of these questions are on page 72 of your journal. And so go ahead and do that. Remember, as a reminder, when roar time goes off, it's not playtime. If you're with me, you immediately come over and see me. Everyone else, you go straight to your Go Formative, and you start working on whatever open assignment is on there. Okay? It's not get up and walk around the room time. It's not anything except, okay, I'm with Ms. Smith today. I go up to the table, or I'm not with Ms. Smith, so I get on Go Formative, and you start work. Okay? Please remember to watch the videos. Okay? You'll need your headphones, but watching the videos is the only way to improve. All right, go ahead and get started on that part. And that's about where we will end up today, is the assignment that you're working on right now.
Page 72?
Yes, 72. This task right here. Yes, answering those questions.